I've lived alone in this mountain cabin for 15 years, and I thought I knew what solitude meant. But last spring, the woods around me changed. It started with my woodpile being mysteriously rearranged in the night by massive hands, but it ended with the most terrifying and beautiful encounter of my life when three giants opened my door, not to attack, but to save me. Before I share the incredible things they taught me, let me know in the comments where you are watching from right now. And if you want to hear more true stories about the hidden people of the forest, please subscribe to the channel. This is the story of how I became a forest keeper. I have lived in this cabin for 15 years, surrounded by nothing but Douglas firs and silence, so I know when the rhythm of the woods changes. I am 73 years old, and my days are defined by routine. Chop wood, tend the garden, maintain the water pump. But in early April, the routine began to fracture in ways that my rational mind couldn't explain. It started with the silence, not the peaceful quiet of the mountains, but a heavy watching stillness that settled over the clearing. The birds stopped singing in the mornings, and the deer that usually grazed near the tree line vanished, leaving me with the distinct sensation that I was no longer the only resident on the ridge. The first physical anomaly appeared in the woodpile I keep stacked against the north wall of the cabin. I am particular about my cordwood. I stack it bark side up to shed the rain, with the kindling separated on the left. But one morning I went out to gather fuel and found the entire pile rearranged. It wasn't scattered or knocked over by a bear, it was restacked. The logs had been sorted not just by size, but by species: cedar on the bottom, fir in the middle, and maple on top. It was a categorization that required intelligence and dexterity, done silently in the middle of the night while I slept just feet away. I spent the morning staring at the wood, trying to convince myself that I had done it during a lapse in memory, but the precision was alien to me. The logs were interlocked with a structural stability that was superior to my own stacking method. I looked for tool marks, thinking perhaps a neighbor had hiked in to play a prank, but there were no tire tracks in the driveway and no boot prints in the mud. The only sign was a faint, musky odor lingering on the bark, a smell like wet dog and ozone that made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't touch the pile again that day. I burned the old wood from the bin inside, afraid to dismantle the sculpture on my porch. On April 8th, the mystery moved from the porch to the garden. I had just tilled the soil for my spring planting, leaving a canvas of soft, dark earth ready for seeds. When I walked out with my coffee, I dropped the mug, shattering it on the stones. Pressed deep into the loam were footprints, massive, impossible footprints. I ran back inside for my tape measure, my heart hammering against my ribs. They measured 18 inches from heel to toe, and the width was nearly double my own winter boots. I stood over them, feeling the cold mountain air bite through my flannel shirt, realizing that whatever made these wasn't wearing shoes. I knelt down to examine the impressions more closely, hoping to find the claw marks of a grizzly to explain the size. But there were no claws. The anatomy was undeniably primate, but wrong. The arch was flat, the heel bone extended further back than a human's, and the toes were the most disturbing part. They didn't just press into the mud, they gripped it. They were long and splayed, looking more like short fingers than toes, suggesting a foot designed for grasping uneven terrain. The stride length between the prints was over 5 feet, indicating a creature of immense height and power walking with a casual gait. That night, the physical evidence was accompanied by sound. I was sitting by the wood stove reading a book when I heard it. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy rhythmic footsteps circling the cabin. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, clutching the armrests of my chair. A bear shuffles. A cougar stalks silently. This sound was the bipedal cadence of 2 legs striking the ground with significant weight. It walked with a heavy, deliberate pace, pausing at the corners of the house as if listening to me inside. The vibrations traveled up through the foundation, shaking the floorboards beneath my feet. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my hunting rifle across my lap, listening to the visitor patrol my perimeter until dawn. The fear wasn't just about the size of the intruder, it was the restraint. A bear that smells food tries to break in. It tears at the siding or smashes a window. This creature was just walking, observing, letting me know it was there without making an aggressive move. It felt like a surveillance operation, a nightly check-in by a landlord I hadn't realized I was renting from. When the sun finally rose, the footsteps stopped, retreating back into the dense timber as the light touched the roof. The next morning, I went to the water pump at the edge of the clearing to fill my buckets. The pump is an old manual iron lever that takes a fair bit of force to operate. The handle, usually clean, was smeared with fresh mud. I looked closer and saw a partial handprint wrapped around the iron bar. It was enormous, the palm width spanning the entire handle, the fingers thick and blunt. But it was what was caught in the jagged metal of the pivot bolt that froze me. A clump of coarse, dark hair, thick as copper wire and black as coal. I pulled the hair free, rolling it between my fingers. It wasn't fur. It didn't have the soft undercoat of a mammal preparing for winter. It felt like the hair from a horse's tail, tough and oily. I looked at the mud on the ground and saw a knee print, as if the giant had knelt down to drink directly from the spout after pumping the water. It was using tools. It understood the mechanics of the lever. It was hydrating itself from my well, utilizing the infrastructure I had built. I stood there by the pump, the bucket heavy in my hand, and looked at the woodpile. The logs were still stacked perfectly. A thought occurred to me, wild and desperate. It was a trade. The creature was taking my water, and in exchange, it was organizing my fuel. It wasn't stealing, it was bartering. I walked back to the cabin, feeling a strange mixture of terror and gratitude. I was safe for now, but as I climbed the porch steps, a wave of dizziness washed over me and I had to grab the railing to keep from falling, my head suddenly throbbing with a fever that felt unnatural. On the morning of April 23rd, the mountain finally exacted its price for my isolation. I woke up with a fever that felt like a forest fire in my blood, my joints locking up with a flu that had likely drifted up from town on a delivery driver. I tried to stand to reach the water pitcher, but the room spun violently, and I pitched forward, striking my temple hard against the corner of the heavy oak table. I hit the floor with a sickening crack, darkness rushing in at the edges of my vision, leaving me paralyzed, bleeding, and utterly alone on the cold linoleum, too weak to crawl to the phone. I lay there for hours as the day turned to twilight, drifting in and out of a delirium where the shadows seemed to stretch and breathe. Somewhere through the haze of pain, I heard voices outside the front door, low, resonant murmurs that vibrated against the floorboards. It wasn't the chatter of hikers or the bark of a dog. It was a complex, rhythmic language of chuffs, whistles, and deep tonal grunts. My fever-addled brain tried to parse it as English or maybe German, but the syntax was alien, ancient, and sounded urgent, as if discussing a problem that needed immediate solving. Then came the sound that shattered my reality. 3 distinct, polite knocks on the door. Knock, knock, knock. It wasn't the battering of a beast trying to break in. It was a request for entry, a courtesy that terrified me more than violence would have. Before I could even croak out a warning, the latch lifted. They knew how to work the thumb latch, and the door swung open. I braced myself for a bear, or perhaps a hallucination born of head trauma, but the figures that ducked under the doorframe were solid, massive, and impossibly tall. 3 of them entered my cabin, filling the small space with a musk of pine resin and wet fur, but surprisingly, no scent of aggression. The leader was a male, easily 8 feet tall, his dark brown hair silvered at the shoulders, moving with a stoic grace that belied his bulk. He was flanked by a female, slightly smaller but fierce-eyed, and a younger one who looked around with wide, curious eyes. They didn't rampage. They moved with the careful precision of guests in a china shop, closing the door behind them to shut out the cold draft, sealing us in together. The large male, who I would come to call Cedar, crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside me. I flinched, expecting a killing blow, but his massive face, framed by a heavy brow and deep-set intelligent eyes, held only concern. He made a low, soothing rumble in his chest, a sound that seemed to vibrate through my own ribs, calming my racing heart. He reached out a hand the size of a shovel, but his touch was feather-light as he brushed the hair away from the gash on my temple to see the damage. Cedar examined my head wound with the focus of a field medic, his thick fingers probing the area around the cut to check for swelling. He leaned in close, sniffing the wound, checking for infection, I realized, and then gently pulled my eyelids up one by one with his thumb, checking my pupil response. This wasn't animal instinct. This was diagnostic procedure. He looked back at the female and made a series of sharp, clicking sounds, shaking his head slightly to indicate the injury wasn't fatal, but required immediate treatment. The female, Willow, didn't need to be told twice. She reached into a pouch made of woven grass hanging from her shoulder and pulled out a handful of dark, dirt-covered roots. She brushed the soil off briskly and popped them into her mouth, chewing with a rhythmic, grinding motion. It wasn't eating, it was processing. She was mixing the plant matter with her saliva, activating whatever chemical properties lay in the roots to create a poultice, her eyes never leaving my face as she worked the medicine into a pulp. She knelt on my other side and spat the thick green paste into her palm, then pressed it gently against the cut on my head. The sensation was immediate, a sharp stinging followed by a numbing, cooling relief that seemed to draw the heat right out of the fever. She held it there, her leather-skinned palm acting as a bandage, humming a low, 3-note melody that sounded like the wind in the fir trees. I stopped shaking. The pain receded into a dull throb, and for the first time in hours, my vision cleared enough to see them not as monsters, but as saviors. While the adults tended to me, the younger one, Swift, moved to the cold hearth of my wood stove. I watched in amazement as he knelt down and rebuilt the fire I had been too weak to tend. He didn't just throw wood in, he built a proper teepee structure with the kindling, allowing for airflow, and used his long fingers to manipulate the embers. He blew gently on the coals until a flame caught, then fed it larger logs with an expert's timing. He looked back at me and grinned, a surprisingly human expression of pride in his task. As the cabin warmed, Willow moved to my small kitchen, smelling the jars on the counter until she found my dried herbs. She combined them with fresh leaves she had brought in. Heating water on the stove, Swift had revived. She brought a steaming mug to my lips, supporting my head with a strength that was absolute yet tender. As I swallowed the bitter, earthy broth, I looked up at Cedar, who was watching me with an intensity that suggested this rescue was just the beginning of a much longer, more difficult conversation. The next 2 days were a blur of recovery and revelation, my fever breaking under the influence of Willow's bitter green soup. I spent the time sitting up in my bed, wrapped in quilts, while 3 massive Sasquatch moved about my cabin with a domestic ease that should have been impossible. They didn't speak English, and I didn't speak their language of trills and clicks, so we began to build a bridge across the species gap using gestures and simple sounds. It started with Cedar, who sat by my bedside, pointing a thick finger at his own chest. He inhaled deeply and let out a resonant, vibrating rumble that sounded like a cello bowed at the bottom of a well, a sound that was more a frequency than a word. I tried to mimic the sound, but my human vocal cords were woefully inadequate for the task, producing a pathetic croak that made the young one, Swift, giggle. Cedar seemed to understand my limitation. He accepted the name I offered him, Cedar, nodding slowly as if the word fit his nature. In return, I pointed to myself and said, "Harold." Cedar leaned in, his amber eyes intense, and repeated it, "Harold." The name came out as a growl, deep and heavy, vibrating the water in the glass on my nightstand. It was the first time my name had been spoken by a non-human tongue, and it felt like a christening. As my strength returned, our vocabulary expanded to the objects around us, revealing a worldview that was fundamentally different from my own. When Swift added a log to the wood stove, he didn't just toss it in, he placed it gently and whispered to the flames. When I asked why, Cedar explained through a complex pantomime that fire wasn't a chemical reaction to them, it was burn life. To them, fire was a living entity that consumed the wood to release heat, a hungry spirit that had to be fed with respect, not treated as a disposal unit for trash. The cultural divide widened when evening fell, and I reached over to switch on the table lamp. As the bulb flared to life, all 3 of them recoiled, shielding their eyes. Cedar approached the lamp cautiously, sniffing the hot glass, and looked at the cord running to the wall. He pointed to the bulb, then to the setting sun outside the window, and clenched his fist. "Sun piece trapped," he grunted, or the closest approximation I could understand. To them, electricity was an act of violence, capturing the essence of the sun and forcing it into a glass cage to work on command. I tried to offer them food from my pantry, thinking a can of peaches would be a treat. Willow took the can, smelling the metal lid with a wrinkled nose. She tapped the tin and shook her head, handing it back unopened. "Food dead," she gestured, moving her hand in a flat, stagnant line. "No life flow." She pointed to the dried roots she had brought and made a spiraling motion with her finger. Energy moving, growing. They believed that food trapped in metal lost its spirit, its connection to the earth, rendering it empty calories that filled the belly but starved the soul. Willow took charge of my education regarding the plants she had used to heal me. She led me to the window, pointing to the herbs growing in my garden box. She acted out a scene of asking, bowing her head to the plant, waiting, and then harvesting. She explained that you don't just take, you ask. Plant choose to help, she conveyed. If the plant wasn't ready or willing, taking it would rob the medicine of its potency. It was a symbiotic relationship where the harvester and the harvest were partners, a concept that made my haphazard weeding seem barbaric. The young one, Swift, provided a lesson on the metaphysical when he became agitated by a framed photograph of my late wife on the mantel. He wouldn't look at it directly, turning his head and holding up a hand to block his view. He pointed to me, then to the picture, and made a gesture of a cage slamming shut. "Spirit trap," he seemed to say. He believed the image had captured a piece of her soul and frozen it in time, preventing her from moving on to the next cycle. I realized then why they were so elusive. They weren't just hiding their bodies. They were protecting their souls from being stolen by our lenses. To bridge the gap in our philosophies, Cedar picked up a coffee table book of nature photography I kept, flipping the pages with surprising delicacy. He stopped at a picture of a grizzly bear standing over a kill. He pointed to the bear, then to himself and said, "Brother." He simulated a bear charging, then stopped, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "Bear teach," he grumbled. He was explaining that strength wasn't a license to dominate. The bear could kill, but often chose to just posture. He looked at me, his face inches from mine, and delivered a lesson that felt like an indictment of my entire species. He pointed to his massive bicep, then to the fragile chair he was sitting on without breaking it. "Strong no mean take all," he said, stringing the English words together with effort. It was the core of their ethics. Just because you have the power to destroy the forest or the river doesn't mean you have the right. They possessed the strength to tear my cabin apart, yet they sat drinking tea. Restraint, to them, was the highest form of power. By the end of the third day, the dynamic in the cabin had shifted. I wasn't just a patient anymore. I was a student in a master class of existence. They were preparing to leave, their ears twitching at sounds outside that I couldn't hear, but they had planted seeds in my mind that were already taking root. As Cedar stood up to go, looking toward the door with a sudden dark gravity, I realized that these lessons weren't just casual conversation. They were arming me. They were giving me the context I would need to understand the danger that was coming, a danger that represented the exact opposite of everything they had just taught me. They returned 3 days later, just as the sun was touching the tops of the pines, but the atmosphere in the clearing was markedly different. There was no gentle curiosity this time, no playful energy from Swift. Cedar stood at the edge of the porch, his massive shoulders slumped with a weight that looked physical, his breathing heavy and ragged. When I opened the door to greet them, expecting another lesson in herbs or fire building, Cedar didn't enter. He simply pointed toward the distant southern ridge, his face a mask of grief and anger, and spoke a single heavy word in English that sounded like a curse. "Takers." I stepped out onto the porch, pulling my coat tight against the morning chill, trying to decipher the meaning behind the word. Cedar looked at me, then at the forest surrounding my cabin, and then back to the south. He made a chopping motion with his hand, violent and repetitive, mimicking a blade striking wood. "Takers come," he grumbled, his voice vibrating in his chest. "Machine beasts eat forest." He held up 5 fingers, 5 days' travel for them, which meant the threat was still miles away but closing in fast. He wasn't talking about hikers. He was talking about an industrial invasion. They gestured for me to follow them, leading me away from the safety of the cabin and up a deer trail that wound steeply toward the high country. It was a grueling 2-hour hike, testing my aging lungs and recovering head, but they adjusted their pace to mine, flanking me like an honor guard. Swift walked ahead, moving branches out of my path, while Cedar brought up the rear, stopping frequently to listen to the wind. They were taking me to the edge of their world to show me the monster that was eating it. When we finally crested the granite ridge, the view that greeted us stopped the breath in my throat. Below us, stretching for hundreds of acres across the adjacent valley, was a landscape of absolute devastation. It was a massive clear-cut operation, a brown scar on the green skin of the earth. The trees were gone, replaced by a chaotic wasteland of stumps, slash piles, and muddy roads. From this height, the logging trucks looked like yellow beetles crawling through the dirt, but the roar of their engines drifted up to us, a constant grinding mechanical scream that drowned out the wind. I raised my binoculars, my hands shaking, and saw the details of the violence. The streams that used to run clear were choked with brown silt, the runoff from the denuded hillsides poisoning the water downstream. The earth was churned into a slurry of mud and oil, stripping away centuries of topsoil in a matter of weeks. Beside me, Cedar let out a sound that was half growl, half moan. He pointed to the devastation and then to his family. "Home before," he said softly. "Now, death place." Cedar turned his back on the valley, unable to watch the machines work any longer. "This drive us back," he said, his voice heavy with the inevitability of it. "Push up. Push deep. Soon. No place left." It was a terrifying realization of their geopolitical reality. They weren't wandering nomads. They were refugees being squeezed into smaller and smaller pockets of wilderness. The takers were shrinking the map, erasing the sanctuaries where the forest people had lived for generations, forcing them into contact with humans like me. I realized then why they had chosen to reveal themselves to me, a solitary old man in a cabin. I wasn't just a curiosity. I was a symbol of possibility. I lived in the woods, but I didn't destroy them. I burned wood, but I didn't clear cut. To them, I was proof that a human could exist without being a taker, that we weren't all biologically programmed to consume everything in our path. I represented a thin, fragile hope that coexistence was possible, If only my species could remember how to live within the balance. Willow stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder to draw my attention away from the destruction. She looked deep into my eyes, her expression fierce and urgent. "We teach you," she said, her limited English strained but clear. "You remember when we gone?" The question hung in the air like a prophecy. She wasn't just teaching me survival skills. She was making me an archivist. She feared that her people might not survive the coming century, and she wanted to ensure that their knowledge, their way of seeing the world, didn't vanish with them. I looked from the clear-cut valley back to the three giants standing on the pristine ridge, understanding the gravity of the pact we were forming. They were entrusting me with the legacy of the forest, appointing me as a keeper of ancient wisdom because they knew they might not always be here to guard it. "I will remember," I promised, my voice thick with emotion. "I will learn everything." Cedar nodded, a slow, solemn dip of his massive head. He accepted my pledge. We turned back toward the cabin, leaving the roar of the machines behind us, but the walk down felt different. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore, I was an apprentice. The forest around us felt more precious, more fragile, and infinitely more alive. As we descended into the tree line, Cedar stopped and touched a massive old-growth cedar tree, resting his forehead against the bark. He was preparing to show me exactly what was being lost, to teach me the language of the woods before the silence took over completely. The days that followed were an immersion into a world I had looked at for 15 years, but never actually seen. Willow took the lead in the mornings, guiding me through the undergrowth to patches of wild ginger and trillium. She stopped before a fern bank, holding her hand out but not touching the fronds, tilting her head as if listening to a whisper I couldn't hear. "Plant spirit," she murmured, gesturing to the green expanse. "Ask first. Plant ready to give. Plant give. Plant need keep strength. We leave alone." It changed harvesting from an act of taking to an act of receiving, a conversation rather than a theft. I felt foolish at first, whispering to a huckleberry bush, but the results were undeniable. When I waited for that subtle sense of permission, a feeling of lightness rather than resistance, the berries seemed sweeter, the roots came up without breaking. Willow showed me that the forest wasn't a silent backdrop. It was a conscious entity. If you just grabbed, you got the body of the plant, but not its vitality. It was a lesson in consent and respect that made my previous gardening methods look like clumsy, arrogant looting. Cedar's lessons were more abstract, dealing with the architecture of time itself. We sat by a rotting log that was nursing a young hemlock sapling, and he drew a circle in the dirt with his finger. "You think line," he said, drawing a straight scratch that ended abruptly. "Start, stop, dead." He shook his head violently, rejecting the concept. He pointed to the circle. "We know round. Your body die, but life energy continue." He gestured to the rot feeding the sapling. "Feed trees. Trees feed deer. Deer feed wolves. Wolves die, feed trees." It was a comforting, terrifying realization that to them, death was just a redistribution of energy, not an end. "All connected," Cedar said, his voice deep and final. "All eternal." He looked at me with those ancient eyes, trying to make me understand that I wasn't an individual ending at my skin, but a temporary vessel for energy that belonged to the mountain. It stripped away the fear of mortality and replaced it with a responsibility to be good soil for whatever came next in the great cycle. Swift took over the practical tracking, showing me the billboard system of the woods that I had been blind to. He pointed out deep vertical scratches on pine bark that I had always assumed were bears sharpening their claws. "No," Swift corrected, tracing the pattern with his long finger. "Territory mark. Say, family here, safe sleep." He showed me arrangements of stones in the creek bed that looked random but were actually directional markers indicating clean water sources upstream. I realized I had been walking through a library of information for decades, completely illiterate to the stories written on the landscape. The theoretical lessons became practical reality on the fourth afternoon when we heard a high-pitched bleating near the property line. We found a young doe, her leg caught in a wire snare left by a poacher. The wire had cut deep, and the animal was thrashing in blind panic, foam at her mouth, terrified of the trap and our presence. My instinct was to rush in with a knife to cut the line, but Cedar held me back with a firm hand. He stepped forward slowly, emitting a low rhythmic hum that sounded like a giant cat purring, a vibration that seemed to calm the air itself. The effect on the deer was instantaneous and miraculous. She stopped thrashing, her wide, terrified eyes locking onto the massive predator approaching her. Logic dictated she should die of fright, but she went still, her breathing slowing to match Cedar's rhythm. He knelt beside her, his massive hands hovering over the wire, and there was no struggle. He spoke to her in soft clicks, a language of reassurance that crossed the species barrier effortlessly. asking for her trust so he could help. I whispered to Swift, watching in awe. Why isn't she afraid? It defied everything I knew about prey psychology. She should have been terrified of the giant. Swift looked at me, perplexed by the question. Fear comes from not knowing, he said, tapping his chest. Dear no we help, dear no spirit. It was a profound indictment of humanity. Animals feared us because we were unpredictable, violent chaos. They didn't fear the Sasquatch because the Sasquatch were consistent. They were part of the order, not the disruptors of it. Cedar snapped the heavy gauge wire with a single twist of his fingers, freeing the leg instantly. He applied a bit of Willow's saliva paste to the cut, and then stepped back to give her space. The doe didn't bolt immediately. She stood up, testing her weight, and then looked at each of us in turn. Cedar, Willow, Swift, and finally me. It was a look of acknowledgement, a conscious thank you before she turned and bounded away into the brush. It was interspecies diplomacy in its purest form, a moment of connection that felt holy. We walked back to the cabin in a silence that felt heavy with significance, the woods feeling more like a community than a wilderness. I felt a sense of belonging I had never experienced in 73 years, a realignment of my soul. But as we reached the edge of my clearing, the peace was shattered. Loud voices, the crunch of heavy boots, and the careless snap of dry branches drifted up from the driveway. The takers hadn't come with bulldozers this time. They had come with backpacks and loud laughter, bringing the chaos of the valley right to my doorstep. On the morning of April 29th, the sanctity of my sanctuary was breached, not by machines, but by the casual arrogance of my own species. Two hikers clad in bright neon gear that screamed against the natural palette of the woods stumbled out of the tree line and onto the edge of my property. They weren't malicious exactly, they were oblivious. Their voices were loud, booming echoes that shattered the stillness, talking over one another about sports scores and office politics, completely deaf to the bird song they were drowning out. I watched from my porch, unseen, as the forest people dissolved into the shadows, vanishing with a silence that made the hikers' clumsy movements seem even more grotesque. I watched with a growing pit in my stomach as the men treated the forest like a theme park. One of them picked up a stone, one of the directional markers Swift had shown me, and skipped it across the creek, cheering when it sank, obliterating a message that might have guided a thirsty animal. They kicked at the moss, snapped dry branches off a pine tree just to have something to swing, and laughed when a squirrel chattered in alarm at their presence. It was a display of dominance, a subconscious assertion that everything around them existed solely for their amusement or disposal. They stopped near my garden to drink water, and when they were finished, they simply dropped their trash, a plastic bottle and a foil wrapper, onto the ground. They didn't look down, they didn't hesitate. They just released the waste and walked away, assuming that the world would absorb their garbage. They hiked back down the driveway without ever noticing the cabin tucked in the trees or the three pairs of giant eyes watching them from the ridge. When the sound of their voices finally faded, the silence that returned wasn't peaceful. It was heavy with judgment. Cedar emerged first, stepping out from behind a massive hemlock tree not 20 feet from where the hikers had stood. His face was a thundercloud, his posture rigid with a tension I hadn't seen since the day on the clear-cut ridge. He didn't look at the trash yet. He looked at me. Those men, taker people, he rumbled, the distinction sharp in his tone. He pointed a thick finger at the retreating figures. See thing, take thing. No ask, no give back. Like machine beasts in valley. He was classifying them as a different subspecies, separating me from the locust-like behavior of the modern world. Willow moved to the spot where they had rested, crouching down to inspect the debris. She picked up the foil wrapper with the tips of her fingers as if it were radioactive. They poison forest, she said softly, her voice filled with a profound, confusing sadness. Drop bad things, not see. It wasn't anger at the mess, it was pity for the blindness. She couldn't comprehend a mind that could walk through a cathedral and leave filth on the floor. To her, it wasn't just litter, it was a severing of the relationship with the land. Swift approached the plastic water bottle, sniffing the opening where the chemical scent of the polymer lingered. He tapped the hard, clear surface and looked at me with wide, questioning eyes. Earth eat? He asked, pointing to the ground. I shook my head, ashamed. No, I explained. Plastic never dies. It stays forever. It never becomes earth again. The reaction from the young Sasquatch was visceral. He dropped the bottle and recoiled, staring at it with genuine horror. To a creature whose entire existence was based on the cycle of life and rot, an object that refused to die was an abomination. Cedar stepped in, placing a hand on Swift's shoulder to steady him. He looked at the bottle, then at the trees around us. Stop flow, he grunted. He understood the violence of it immediately. Creating something that couldn't return to the soil was an act of war against the natural order. It was a blockage in the arteries of the world. Taker people make dead things, Cedar said, realizing the terrifying permanence of our industry. Make dead things stay. It was the most damning definition of humanity I had ever heard. He turned to me, his expression softening but still serious, intent on ensuring I understood the gravity of the lesson. All things borrowed, he said, sweeping his arm across the vista of the forest. Borrowed from earth, must give back. It was the central pillar of their philosophy. You could take a life to eat, you could take wood to burn, but you had to return the energy eventually. The hikers and the culture they represented had forgotten the repayment part of the contract. We were taking loans we had no intention of settling. Willow gathered the trash, not to throw it away, but to hand it to me. You keep her now, she said. You hide bad things from Earth. It was a heavy task. She wasn't just asking me to be a janitor. She was asking me to be a filter, to stand between the ignorance of my species and the sanctity of theirs. I took the bottle and the wrapper, feeling the weight of the plastic like a stone. I promised them I would dispose of it properly, to remove the poison from their home. Cedar watched me put the trash in my bin, his amber eyes reflecting the afternoon sun. We keep balance, he said, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. We wait, until you remember to. He was positioning his people not as wild animals, but as the guardians holding the line until humanity woke up from its fever dream of consumption. He looked at the sun dipping lower in the sky, signaling that their time here was drawing to a close. The season was turning, and before they left, there was one final layer of their history they needed to reveal. As the days lengthened and the wildflowers began to bloom, Swift's grasp of English grew with a startling speed, fueled by an insatiable curiosity about my world. We sat on the porch steps in the twilight, and he explained, in broken but profound sentences, exactly who they were. We not animal, he said, struggling to find the word. We forest keepers. He gestured to the mountains stretching endlessly behind us. Grandfathers live here. Grandfathers' grandfathers. Many snows. He described a lineage that went back thousands of years, a continuous, unbroken chain of custody over these mountains. They weren't transient beasts. They were the oldest dynasty in North America. Swift's history lesson revealed a tragic divergence. Long past your people, our people, share forest, he explained, weaving his fingers together to show unity. Both balance, walk same path. He looked at me with a sadness that seemed too old for his young face. Your people forget Earth Mother. Start take, no give. Build stone walls, forget song. It wasn't a war that separated us, but a spiritual amnesia. Humanity had numbly drifted away from the rhythm of the world, while his people had stayed behind to guard the music we had forgotten how to hear. Willow deepened this education by revealing the hidden mechanics of their medicine. She sat me down in the garden and placed her hand over a cluster of foxglove, closing her eyes. Plant talk, she whispered. She explained that it wasn't enough to know which herb healed a wound. You had to know if the herb was willing to be used. She taught me that plants have a frequency, a vibration of life, and that harvesting them without permission dulled that vibration. Ask spirit, she insisted. If plants say yes, medicine's strong. If plants say no, just grass. It was a level of botany that bridged into theology. Cedar took the lessons further, describing a reality that modern science is only just beginning to uncover. He took me to a massive stump of a tree cut down a century ago, yet the roots were still alive, fed by the surrounding saplings. He dug his fingers into the soil, pulling up a web of white fungal threads. Tree talk, he rumbled. Root hold hand under earth. He explained how the forest communicates through this network, sharing nutrients and warnings. One tree hurt, all forests know, he said. He was describing the mycelial network, the wood wide web, centuries before I read about it in any scientific journal. He taught me about the intricate domino effect causality of nature. He showed me how the absence of wolves made the rivers change course because the deer ate the willow banks that held the soil. He explained that the specific frequency of bird songs at dawn actually stimulated the opening of stomata on leaves, helping the forest breathe. Nothing alone, Cedar said, locking eyes with me. Birdsong make tree grow, wolf tooth make river clear. To them, the ecosystem wasn't a collection of parts, it was a single breathing organism, and they were its white blood cells. The conversation turned somber when they spoke of their numbers. Few now, Cedar admitted, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. Hidden places small. He explained that there were only a few hundred of them left in these ranges, scattered clans constantly moving to avoid the encroaching roads and logging camps. They were a civilization in twilight, holding on to the old ways while the world of concrete and steel closed in around them. "We hide to live," he said. "If seen, we die, or become zoo thing." The fear of capture was ancestral and absolute. As the sun began to set on their final evening, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, Cedar stood up and formally approached me. It felt like a ceremony. He placed his heavy hand on my head, a benediction that carried the weight of the mountain. "You, forest keeper now," he declared. It wasn't just a compliment, it was a conscription. By sharing their knowledge, they were deputizing me. I was no longer just a retiree in a cabin. I was an outpost of their culture, a sleeper agent of the wild planted in the world of men. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, and delivered the most critical warning of all. "Speak to no man," he commanded. "No picture, no word. Taker people come if no." He gestured to the valley where the clear-cut lay. "They eat forest to find us." He was making me the keeper of their safety. If I told the world I wouldn't be famous, I would be the architect of their extinction. My silence was the only shield they had left against a world that consumed everything it touched. I looked at the three of them, Cedar, the wise protector, Willow, the healer, and Swift, the hope for the future, and I felt a fierce burning loyalty swell in my chest. "I promise," I said, my voice shaking. "I will be the grave of this secret. No one will know." Cedar held my gaze for a long moment, reading the truth in my pulse and my scent. He nodded once, satisfied. "Good," he grumbled. "You bear brother now." They began to gather their few belongings, the woven bags, the walking sticks, preparing to move higher into the peaks for the summer migration. The air in the clearing felt charged, heavy with the finality of their departure. They had given me the keys to the kingdom, showing me a world of magic and connection that I had been blind to for 73 years. Now, they were leaving me to guard my small patch of it alone. But as Cedar turned toward the dark timber, I realized the hardest part wasn't the goodbye. It was figuring out how to live the rest of my life carrying a truth that changed everything. They left at dawn on April 30th, dissolving into the morning mist with a silence so profound that I questioned for a moment if they had ever been there at all. But the perfectly stacked woodpile was still on my porch, and the mud around the pump still bore the impression of Cedar's massive hand. The cabin felt emptier than it had in 15 years, yet the crushing loneliness I used to feel was gone. The silence wasn't a void anymore. It was a frequency I was finally tuned into, a quiet hum of life that connected the ridge to the river. I wasn't an isolated old man anymore. I was a sentry at his post, watching the trail for his friend's return. I wasted no time in restructuring my life around the principles they had taught me. I went to my garden, which had always been a grid of military precision, and tore up the straight rows. I replanted according to Willow's instructions, mixing species together that supported one another. Beans climbing the corn stalks, squash shading the roots to keep the moisture in. I stood over the soil each morning, closing my eyes and asking the plants for permission to tend them, feeling foolish at first, but then feeling a subtle, warming sensation in my chest that felt like an answer. I was no longer a dictator in my garden, I was a partner. The results of this new methodology were nothing short of miraculous. The vegetables that summer grew with a vigor and resilience I had never seen in decades of farming. The tomatoes were sweeter, the kale leaves dark and rich with nutrients, as if the plants were eager to feed someone who finally respected them. I realized Willow was right. When you force the earth, you get calories, but when you ask the earth, you get vitality. I ate meals that felt electric. The life flow Cedar spoke of transferring from the soil to my own aging body, giving me an energy I hadn't felt since my 40s. I changed the way I moved through the forest, consciously unlearning the heavy boot-stomping gait of a human. I practiced walking like Swift, rolling my foot from the outside edge to the ball, feeling for twigs before committing my weight. It took months of discipline, but slowly I became a shadow in my own woods. I learned to freeze when the wind shifted, to listen before I looked, and to blend my silhouette into the tree line. I wasn't hiking anymore. I was flowing through the landscape, a non-intrusive element that left no wake in the stillness. The animals were the first to notice the change. By July, the deer that used to bolt at the snap of a twig would simply lift their heads and watch me pass, chewing their cud without fear. A coyote I had seen for years, usually a ghost on the periphery, sat on a stump 10 yards away and watched me chop wood, accepting me as a fellow predator rather than a threat. I had crossed the invisible barrier that separates man from nature. To the forest, I was no longer a taker. I had become a harmless feature of the ecosystem, as benign as a moss-covered rock. Though I haven't seen Cedar, Willow, or Swift since that morning, the conversation between us hasn't stopped. I find signs of their passage in the subtle language of the trail. One morning, after a storm knocked out my power and left my back aching, I woke to find a bundle of pitch-rich kindling left on the top step of my porch. Wood from a lightning-struck pine that burns hot and fast. Another time, I found a pristine owl feather tucked into the latch of my garden gate. A gift left in the night by a hand large enough to crush the gate, but gentle enough to leave the feather undisturbed. I started leaving messages back. I would stack stones in the creek bed in the pattern Swift taught me, indicating that the water was clean and the area was safe. I would leave the best of my garden harvest, the largest squash, the sweetest carrots, on a flat rock at the edge of the tree line. By morning, the food would be gone, replaced by a smooth riverstone or a braid of sweetgrass. It is a silent, ongoing dialogue of gratitude, a confirmation that the treaty holds and that they are still out there, watching over the keeper they trained. The hardest part of my new life is keeping the promise of silence. Hikers still come through occasionally, and once a weekend researcher with a recorder asked me if I'd ever seen anything weird up here. I looked him in the eye, channeling Cedar's stoic calm, and lied with a perfectly straight face. Not a thing, I told him. Just bears and bobcats. I watched him leave, disappointed, and felt the weight of the secret settle comfortably on my shoulders. I am the firewall. My feigned ignorance is the only thing standing between the forest people and the thermal cameras that would hunt them down. I write these things down in my journal at night, not for publication, but to preserve the knowledge Willow and Cedar entrusted to me. I document the plant spirits, the circular time, and the language of the roots, creating a manual for a way of life that is nearly extinct. I write that the forest keepers continue their work in the deep places that don't appear on any map, stitching the world back together while we try to tear it apart. I am an archive of a civilization that refuses to die, holding the door open for the day when humanity might be ready to remember its own roots. I am 73 years old now, and the winter is coming on fast. My joints ache, and the woodpile is getting harder to stack, but I am content. I sit on my porch as the first snow begins to fall, watching the dark timberline, knowing that I am not alone. I have been given the greatest honor any human can achieve, to be considered worthy of the trust of the giants who share this beautiful, fragile planet with us. The forest is deep, and the night is dark, but I am not afraid. I am a forest keeper, and my watch has only just begun.